Right. Welcome everyone to the second workshop for ICYD 2022. It's lovely to see so many of you here. This workshop today will be on preparing cases. So just a little bit of logistics before we begin. Much of this is the same as last time. This workshop might refer to content from the first workshop, which was called Introduction to BP Debating. However, I've designed it so that you should still be able to follow along even if you didn't come to that first one, although I would recommend watching the video or reading through the slides at some point. Like last time, this presentation and a video recording of the workshop will be posted on the ICYD 2022 website. It's the same link which is there. And as usual, please ask questions in the Zoom chat. It's one of the great benefits of attending live, is that if you have any questions about things, you can put them there and I'll be able to answer them. I might answer them at the end of the slide. If they're not immediately related, I might leave them until the end, but I do see the Zoom chat and I will be answering questions throughout the workshop. In terms of what we're going to go through today, firstly, we're going to have a look at preparation time and how you might use that in a BP format where you only have 15 minutes. We'll go through some ideas as to how you might generate material or come up with substantive points. And after that, we'll do a couple of examples of how you might explain and analyze practical points and also principled points in detail. So starting with preparation time. There's two features of preparation time in BP debating, which we mentioned very briefly last week, that might be different to other debating formats. The first of these is that there's a very limited amount of time to prepare. You only have 15 minutes. And what that means for you is that you need to be quite efficient in what you do during those 15 minutes. Because if you're the Prime Minister, who's the first speaker in the debate, after those 15 minutes, you'll be starting your speech. So you want to make sure that you're ready. Part of what this means is that there isn't really going to be enough time for you to write out speeches in full. So you shouldn't go into a debate with the mindset that you want to write out your entire speech in full sentences so you can just read off it. You're not really going to have the time for that. It's also just not particularly advisable in general, because it means you don't have as much flexibility to be responsive to other things that have happened in a debate. Instead, we would encourage you to use bullet points, shorthands, other ways that you might be able to save time during preparation so you can get more content prepared and then just turn this into sentences while you're speaking. That might take a little bit of getting used to at first, but it's a really important and useful skill to have. The second part of BP debating is that during this preparation time, you're not allowed any outside help. So you're not allowed to consult teachers, coaches, the internet during this time. And that raises a question, naturally, of how you might prepare having no access to all of these materials if you're used to doing research on the internet or through books or asking other people as to what points you might run. So basically the standard within BP is that we expect people to have a broad but not particularly deep knowledge of the world and issues that are going on today. So basically this means someone who might be reading the headlines of a major international newspaper like the BBC. So this is something that we would encourage you to do if you don't do already, to have a read of the news. The BBC's quite good. You can also have other websites if you prefer those instead. But basically you should have some knowledge of what's going on in the world. This is also reflected in the rules of BP debating. So how judges judge a debate is they are supposed to act as what we call an ordinary intelligent voter who has this broad but not particularly deep knowledge of the world. They're not set to a specific time or place in the world. So there's nothing saying that arguments only apply to the UK or another part of the world. These judges are not biased, so they don't have like a personal leaning towards one side of the argument or another, and they can follow arguments even if they're quite sophisticated and complicated. So what that means is that even if you don't have particularly technical knowledge about a subject, if you don't know the facts or statistics, that's perfectly fine. That's what we expect. What we value instead is your ability to come up with arguments nonetheless and explain them one step at a time and in detail. So motions are set with these rules in mind. So we're not going to set a motion about something really specific that you haven't really heard of. However, if we do deem that additional information is necessary for a motion, then we will provide an information slide around the motion as well. And how that works is that before the motion gets announced, we'll say that there is an info slide for this motion. We'll read out the info slide, give you a minute to write it down or take a photo of it or whatever. And that information slide might tell you a bit more about the situation at hand if we think that is necessary. You don't need to worry a great deal about this no outside help part. As long as you have this broad awareness of what's going on in the world, you should be fine in terms of the knowledge required. Right. Okay, so what are your goals in preparation time for opening team? And I say opening here because as a closing team, you work rather differently. We'll look at how to prepare as a closing team and extensions next week. So as an opening team, because you're up as soon as preparation time is over, you want to have your case ready. So that means coming up with the points that you want to run, deciding as a team which points you want to run, developing those points so you can actually explain them instead of just providing one or two sentences, and also anticipating opposition material in advance so you know that it's coming and you can think about how to respond instead of having to do all of that within the debate itself. So how might you accomplish all of that within the 15 minutes that you have to prepare your case? So this is one possible timeline, and like a lot of the things that I'm going to go through in these presentations, it's just one way of doing things. Most debaters prepare differently. If you decide that this doesn't work, you might adjust the timings, you might do something else. So what we've got here is to start off with, you have a minute or two. I've got 2 minutes here of individual brainstorming. And this is actually quite useful because everyone will read the motion differently. Everyone will come up with different ideas. And when you have two people in a team, first just quickly thinking about the motion independently, you're going to get some extra perspectives from that activity. Another way you could make the most of this is that if you are being a bit more sophisticated and you want to think about the debate as a whole, what the opposition team might run, what you want to focus on in the debate, is that you can get the second speaker to prepare the opposition side of the debate. So even if you're on opening government and you're trying to argue for the motion, during the first 2 minutes of preparation time, you might agree that the first speaker prepares the government case and the second speaker tries to think of what opposition might run. And what that does is that gives you even more ideas about how the motion might play out and how what opposition might run, what you might need to run to engage with that and win those areas of clash. Once you've done that, you then move on to share these ideas with your partner, discuss the ideas. You might have questions about how certain points work or like additional impacts that come out of them. And at the end of this, you want to decide on what points you're going to run. It's quite important that you do this as a team because if you're not coherent in terms of your case, if you run things that are conflicting or contradicting, that's not going to work very well for you. And also, even if you're like the second speaker, you need to understand what the first speaker is saying so that you're able to defend it and rebuild it when it's inevitably attacked within the debate itself. Once you've decided on the points as a team, you want to develop those points. We'll see how to do this in detail later in this presentation. And if you're the second speaker, you still have work to do during this time. You've only got 15 minutes, so everything that you do is helpful. You can help your first speaker develop points. You can develop a point of your own if you're going to run one, and you can come up with responses to material that the other team is likely to run, so you're more prepared and able to do that within a debate. When you're developing your points, this is not necessarily a silent process. That would be quite sad. You should keep talking to each other. And quite often what you'll do is you'll write a few things down that you've come up with, and then you'll ask your partner, can I have some extra reasons as to why this thing works? Or can you tell me your thinking on this point again, so you have that down. And that's quite useful just so you have more ideas when you're explaining these points, and also that you understand what each other are running for this. And finally, as I've commented already, your timings may vary. You might discover that you struggle to come up with any ideas in 2 minutes and you prefer to do a bit more individual brainstorming, or you might discover that you prefer to spend more time developing your points, and then you might spend more time doing on that. So this does take a bit of practice, and then you can work out with your partner what you prefer to do and the most efficient way of using preparation time. So this is these timings are only a guideline. Please feel free to be flexible with those. Right. Are there any questions so far? No one's said anything before we move on. So just type something in the Zoom chat and I'll have a look at it whenever it comes up. Okay, so this next section, we're going to go through lots of different ways to come up with points. As we mentioned last time, a substantive point is a good reason to support or oppose the motion. So here are some different ideas for coming up with points, which we'll look at over the next few slides with some examples. You can read the motion really closely and try to ask yourself why the motion has been phrased the way it has been. You can ask yourself why the motion was set, what the context is behind the motion, and any problems that the motion might be intended to solve. You can think about the stakeholders, which are the people who are going to be affected by the motion and how they're affected. You can think about what the opposing team might say and how this might clash with your material, producing the areas of clash within the debate. You could also ask yourself, what do you want to achieve? There are lots of different ways to generate material, as we're seeing over here. And through practice, hopefully, you'll be able to figure out what works best for you. Some of these things might work better on some motions than others. So you should just work out a process that works for you and your teammate. Right. So the first of these ideas, reading the motion closely. So what you want to do here is to make sure that you understand the motion, especially if it's quite long, it only applies in certain cases. You can ask yourself, why is each word in the motion here? So we've got this example, which is this house would make voting compulsory. So if you look at this motion, I think the two most important words here are voting and compulsory. So if you look at the word, so I think this is quite a short motion, which is why this is not going to get us too far, but still it's useful. So when we come to voting, you might ask yourself, like, what sort of elections is this referring to? Maybe you want to model it as local elections or national elections, or probably both of them. Why do we care about voting? Why is it important for people to vote? So that might give you some ideas as to what you might say within the debate. Then we have this word compulsory. So that's quite a hard stance to be taking. Like, quite often we encourage people to do things. Sometimes we ban things or we force people to do things. So then you might ask yourself, like, what is this intended to solve? Why do we need to make voting compulsory? Right. So that's reading the motion closely. The next idea here is just like, why was the motion set? Looking at the context and the problems. So what you might do here is you might ask yourself, why was the motion set? Is there anything particularly topical going on? Maybe this is a topic that's been in the news lately. What does the world currently look like when it comes to the motion? What problems what problems is the motion meant to solve? And you can then turn that into points. So in the case of making voting compulsory, maybe it solves the problem of low voter turnout, and you would then maybe be able to run a point on higher turnout. You could have perhaps you identify another problem being that voter turnout is particularly low for certain groups. So then you might be able to run a point on government being more representative of these groups that are currently underrepresented. And then you might have identified that at the moment there's very low engagement with politics among certain groups of people. And then you might be able to run a point on more engagement with politics. The next idea that we have here is to look at the stakeholders within a debate. And as I think I've mentioned already, stakeholders is just another word for the people and groups that will be affected by the motion. And what you do here is you can sort of make a list of these stakeholders, ask yourself who's affected by the motion. If you have really broad groups of people, you can break them down into more smaller groups within them that might be affected differently. And then you ask yourself, how are they affected? Whether this is positive or negative, or if you can come up with multiple ways in which stakeholders are going to be affected. So in the case of this House would make voting compulsory, voters, they're still going to vote. I'm not sure if too much happens there. There are people who might previously not be voters, but now become voters because they have to. So they're now going to vote. That might lead to some impacts. They also might become more engaged within the political process, which might have certain impacts. There's also politicians here who might need to engage with a wider group of people now that everyone is voting, who might change their actions in certain ways. You can also add like the government and society to this list as well. So that's stakeholders. Then we have this idea around opposition material and areas of clash. So what you might ask yourself here is, what is the opposing team likely to run? So if you're opening government, you might think about what side opposition might run. If you're opening opposition, you'll think of what side government wants to run. You want to identify how this engages with your material, which hopefully leads to what we call areas of clash within the debate. So back to this example of this House would make voting compulsory. Opposition might argue that it's not right to force people to do this, and it might make politics worse in some ways. So then if you compare this with the ideas that you've already got, you might identify that there's a principled clash within the debate of this question of whether it's right to force people to vote. And that might help you generate some more material as well. So you might create a point as a result of this about the duty or responsibility that individuals have to vote. Then obviously there's a practical area of clash as well around what happens to politics, and all of your points about representation and engagement can fall under that. Right. And I think the final idea that I've got here is you can ask yourself what you're trying to achieve. So when it comes to, you can identify, when you see a motion, you can identify the theme of a motion. So in the case of this House of make voting compulsory, it's probably politics and governance. So then you might want to identify things that you would like to achieve when it comes to politics and governments, such as greater participation and engagement in the political system. A government that's more representative of everyone in society, especially disadvantaged groups, there's a typo there, and a government that's more accountable to the public at large. So then you might think about how the motion achieves these things and come up with a chain of reasoning leading to each of these outcomes. That might also help you generate additional material. So I've very quickly gone through there a couple of different ways in which you can generate material and come up with some ideas. Before I move on to this next slide about deciding the case, there's this question in the Zoom chat that I've ignored for a short while, sorry about that. And the question is basically, what do you do on closing? And the question, yeah, so the question's like, how does this change for closing, because the opening team might take the more obvious points already. So this is something that's very unique to BP, since most other debating formats don't have the concept of the closing team. We'll look at this in more detail next week, but the short answer is essentially, if we go back to, I think, this timeline here, where if you're on opening, you brainstorm ideas, you come up with some points, and then you spend about half the time just developing those points. When it comes to closing, you need to be a bit more responsive to the debate that happens. You don't want to just repeat what your opening team has said, because then you're not going to get very much credit for it. So instead, the short answer is that you want to spend more time coming up with a greater variety of points. And then, depending on what has been said in the debate, adjust your case to run the points that haven't been made and are more likely to be significant to the debate that has happened. We'll look at this in a lot more detail next week, but that's a short answer. Instead of just picking 2 or 3 points and developing them in detail, on closing, you want to come up with a greater variety of points. Maybe that means thinking through these ideas a little bit more deeply. Maybe it involves coming up with points and then thinking about what the links are that opening might miss. Maybe it involves thinking about what the opening teams are likely to run clash on and how you might be able to resolve those clashes. But this is a very good question, and it's probably the biggest struggle that teams have at first when they start BP debating, which is why we're going to devote a whole workshop, not this week, but next week, on the closing question. Okay, so once you've come up with some of those ideas, as a team, you should decide the case that you're going to run collectively. So you want to discuss your ideas, evaluate them. You might have questions for each other, like what happens if opposition says this. Then decide on your points and allocate them within your team. When you're allocating your points, the points should be distinct. So they should be different from each other. You shouldn't run 5 points that are all basically the same thing. And they should stand alone. So ideally, you shouldn't have 3 points with each point depending on the earlier one, because then you just really have one really long point. And if the first point is taken down, the rest of your material would collapse. You should name your points very clearly. So the name of a point should be quite short and clear. And if you have like 10 different ideas, then you've done a quite good job, but you're not going to have enough time to analyze all of them in full. So you want to prioritize what you think is going to be the more important material within the debate. So back to our example of this House would make voting compulsory. So maybe the 3 points that you settle on as opening government in this debate might be, firstly, that the government is going to be more representative, especially of certain groups. Secondly, that there's a moral duty to vote. And thirdly, that there's more engagement with politics at large. And you might allocate the first 2 of these points to the Prime Minister and the third to the Deputy Prime Minister, noting that you want to generally put the more important material and up earlier, and also give the Prime Minister more material than the Deputy as well. So you decide the case and then you allocate your material. Once you've done that, at least for an opening team, the next half of your prep time is really to develop these points in detail. And when it comes to substantive points, they broadly fall into 2 categories. The first of these is principled points, and these are about what is right, such as rights, responsibilities, morals, and ethics. The second type of substantive points are practical points, and they're about physical outcomes, such as the benefits and harms that the motion is going to have on stakeholders. So let's do some examples again. In the case of this House would make voting compulsory, this first point that the government is going to be more representative is a physical outcome. It means that the government is going to do something differently. So that's a practical point. The next point here about a moral duty to vote. This is about an abstract duty that individuals have. It's not about the consequences of this vote, but just that individuals should, in the abstract sense, in some moral sense or in some principled sense, vote, which makes this a principled point. And finally, that there's going to be more engagement in politics. So this is something quite concrete that happens to people. They might read the news more, they might pay more attention to what's going on, they might submit on government policy. So that's a practical outcome as well. Right. Moving on then to how you might develop these points, which are a little bit different. And developing your substantive points is really important because ultimately what's going to win you the debate is the quality of your points, not necessarily the quantity of them. We don't judge debates by counting up how many points each side has provided. We look at how well explained they are, how relevant they are to the debate, and how important they are. So one way that you can develop practical substantive points is to go through these 5 parts. Firstly, the name of the point, just so we know what you're about to argue. In your speech, you would say something like, and now I'm going to move on to my first substantive point, which is about the government becoming more representative of the people. After that, you go through what the context is and the problem that you're trying to fix. Then you provide the mechanisms, which are the precise ways in which the motion fixes the problem. After that, you identify your outcomes, and then you tell me why those outcomes are important or significant to the debate as a whole. So this is quite a fair bit to remember. So you can think of this as like problem, action, solution. I've heard this quite often. So essentially what you want to do is to have what the problem is at the moment, how the motion fixes it, and then how everything's really good afterwards. Or you can think about this in terms of now, action, then. And once you've gone through all of that, why this is important. Because in a lot of debates, there's going to be lots of claims flying around. You want to explain why your claims are more important than the other ones within a debate. Right, so the first part of this, the context or the problem. So what you want to ask yourself here is, what is the context in which the debate is taking place? What are the problems that you're trying to fix? So let's have a look at this example of more representative government on the motion that this House would make voting compulsory. So I think the problems we identified was that there's low voter turnout, certain groups of people are less likely to vote, and as a result, the government's just less incentivized to pay attention to them or devise policy that helps them. So you would explain this. And bearing in mind what I said earlier about having a very limited amount of time during preparation, you would probably write just the keywords or bullet points here instead of the full sentences that I've got. So how might you explain this? Currently, some groups of people are less likely to vote than others, for example, young people or poorer people. And this might be because they're less engaged in the political process, they're more likely to feel disenfranchised, they feel like the government isn't there to help them, and therefore their vote isn't worth anything. As a result of this, governments have less incentive to cater towards these groups of people. This means that policy that's likely to help them, maybe climate policy in the case of young people, or more welfare in the case of poorer people, is less likely to happen. And so that's a short explanation of what the problem is that you're trying to fix here. Once you've established the problem, you then move on to how you fix the problem. And this is probably the most important part of practical points, because quite often teams will not dispute whether the problem exists, but rather argue about whether the motion actually fixes the problem at hand. So I think most people just know that there is low voter turnout, and voter turnout is particularly low for young people. So you can't really reject that as the opposition team. You would argue as to whether the motion actually fixes it. So when it comes to mechanisms, you want to aim for multiple mechanisms, especially on claims that you know are going to be controversial within the debate. So in this case of more representative government, you might say that compulsory voting means that everyone will vote, including groups for which turnout is currently low. And political parties care about votes because they want to win elections, so they will now cater more to these previously underrepresented groups. So you want to be comparative in your analysis here, and that just means comparing the old world to the new world. Notice here that I'm not claiming that suddenly this will fix all problems, or suddenly the government is going to fix climate change because of more young people being forced to vote, but rather that just comparatively, they're a bit more likely to do so as a result of the motion. I think this motion's a little bit unusual in that because you're making voting compulsory, everyone will vote. That part is not really going to be disputed. The part that's more likely going to be disputed is going to be this part about political party, whether the governments or political parties actually change in terms of their actions. Right. Before we move on, we have a question about how teammates are going to be communicating with each other within debates. And this is really important. So the answer is yes, absolutely. You're still able to and absolutely should be communicating with your teammates even during online debates. So there's lots of different ways you can do this. Within an in-person debate, you usually just whisper to each other or write notes to each other. For online debate, there's a variety of things that debaters have worked out to do during COVID. So I think the first of these is that even if a debate takes place online, you can still prepare together in person. So you can debate from the same room on the same device. That means you can just talk to each other, pass notes to each other, do all of those things. Obviously, we recognize that sometimes that's not possible. So what else can you do if debates are taken online to communicate with your teammates? So basically, you can use like all sorts of different platforms that you probably want to arrange beforehand with your partner. So I know some debaters have like an additional call going with their teammate during the debate, which allows them to talk to each other. If you do this, you want to be careful as to where you're muted and where you're not muted, so you don't interrupt the debate itself. I think other people find it quite helpful to type to each other. So if the debates take place on Zoom, you can use the private chat if that's enabled to type to each other. I think if debates take place on Discord, that's another platform that a lot of speakers use. Maybe WhatsApp, maybe it's Messenger is one that a lot of debaters use as well. So this is something that you should just arrange with your partner. But the other thing that's really become popular during online debating is just Google Docs, because both of you can type on that. You could also just see what the other speaker is about to say, which saves you time in that purpose. So you can use that as well. And Google Docs is really useful when it comes to collaboration, especially for closing, because you can both contribute mechanisms at the same time on the same piece of paper, and both of you can look at that while giving your speeches. You'll just need to set up your screen so it shows both things. So the answer to that is absolutely, you should be communicating. There's lots of different ways to do so, even when debating online, and you just need to work out what that's going to be with your partner before the debate itself. Right. Okay, back to the parts of different practical points. So far we've looked at context, mechanisms. After your mechanisms, you get to the outcomes. So in terms of outcomes, what we're asking about here is just what the consequences of the motion are. And you want to be as concrete as possible, because if you say something like more representative government, that's a little bit fuzzy. We're not sure what that actually means or why we should care about it. So what you would say here is that maybe the government engages more with previously underrepresented groups. They're more likely to include them in campaigns. They're more likely to go out into those constituencies and engage with them, or tell them to engage on consultations, for example. I think I've said that in the next point. Political parties are then more likely to campaign on and pass policies that particularly benefit these groups. So in terms of concrete policies, a lot of polling shows that younger generations tend to care more about climate change. If political parties have to reorient towards young people because of the fact that a lot more of them are now voting, then they're more likely to campaign on climate policy. And then you can tell me why that's really useful. So that's the outcomes. After the outcomes, because there are lots of outcomes in the debate, you want to tell me why your point is important, especially relative to the other points within the debate, and what the significance of the point is to the debate as a whole. So in the case of more representative government, you might say that this is a really important point because there's a large impact of better government policy that affects everyone within society. On top of this, you might say that there's a particular responsibility, and it's particularly important for us to help some of these groups, such as young people or poorer people, because they have less social and financial capital otherwise, and therefore need this government support the most. You might also have like moral reasons, such as how the government must represent all of the people within society in order to be legitimate, because this is where its claim to legitimacy comes from. So I think what we've just done there is very quickly gone through all of the aspects or the parts of a principal point. I mean, name, context, problems, mechanisms, outcomes, importance, significance. There's a lot to take in, so I'm making the slides available after this presentation, so you can have a look at them yourself if you haven't taken all of this in immediately. I think the thing to keep in mind when you're developing points, and this is just useful in general, is to ask yourself what's likely to be contentious. And that just means the parts where the opposing team is likely to disagree with you. So when you're going through this point of like more representative government, you can ask yourself, if you're an opposing team, so if you're OO and OG ran this point about representative government, how would you attack it? And this is useful exercise because then you know which parts to focus on. They're probably not going to deny that there's relatively low voter turnout now, and it's really low among young people, because that's just empirically true and relatively well known. Where they are going to attack this is probably around the mechanisms of whether political parties are going to change all that much. And what that tells you is that okay, they'll accept that compulsory voting works in the sense that more people are now voting, but they might not agree as to whether this actually changes anything when it comes to the government passing policy for certain groups of people. So if you keep this in mind, then you know to focus on those specific mechanisms when developing your case. Another interesting exercise for you to do would be to take the second substantive point that we identified around just more engagement in politics. So be an exercise to just develop that point along these lines. I think when it comes to that, the challenge from opposition will definitely be in terms of mechanisms. So opposition will probably respond to this along the lines of, if people aren't voting at the moment, then voting is pretty easy, at least within the UK, which means that you probably don't care very much about politics already. You've shown that that's what you think about voting, politics, and governance. Therefore, forcing you to vote is probably just going to make you a bit annoyed. It's unclear why it's going to make you care anymore about politics itself, and therefore you're not going to get the benefits. So then, if you identify that from government side, you would want to just focus on those explanations of why people are going to be more engaged with politics. Maybe some people, maybe some of them a little bit more engaged, but you want to identify how that happens and focus on those mechanisms so you are able to show that within the debate, despite what attacks you might get from opposition. So that's, in a nutshell, how you might develop a practical point. So one of the most common points of feedback that we do give to beginners when you start out is to explain your points a little bit more. So hopefully now you have a slightly better idea of what we mean by that and how you can go through at least practical points in a bit more detail so that they're stronger within the debate. Before we move on to principal points, are there any questions about this? Okay, so yeah, I think this is a process of practice, which is why you should do this exercise. And if you try to do this a couple of times, you'll get better and better at this as well. Right. Moving on then to principal points. So the other kind of substantive points that are mainly based on like ethical or moral or principled considerations. So these are a little bit different because you don't have mechanisms, because you just don't have outcomes in the case of principal points. So you want to develop them a little bit differently. One way you can do this is to just start off with the name of your point, then an explanation of the principle, an analogy, and analogies are similar situations where the same principle applies. Then you apply the principle back to the point, and then you tell us about the importance and the significance of your principled argument. So going through each of these in turn, we've already said in terms of the name that it should be clear what the point is about. Explanation. So you want to identify what the general principle is for your argument and explain why it holds. Quite often, it's useful to think about rights, roles, responsibilities, and relationships, whether this be on the part of individuals or groups that are relevant within the debate. So for example, on this idea that there's a moral duty to vote, you might argue that there's a reciprocal responsibility here because individuals benefit from being part of the society and therefore have obligations or responsibilities to it. You might also have justifications along practical lines, although you want to be a little bit more careful about that because quite often principles justified on practical lines end up just being, if something is beneficial, we should do it, which is not particularly helpful because then it just dissolves back into the practical argument. So maybe here you argue that without individuals contributing, society wouldn't function, and that governments in particular are the people who compel people, governments can compel people to fulfill these responsibilities. Right. Okay. Maybe it's you might want to say a bit more about why it's the government who does this, because they represent society, or that they just maintain law and order, or they provide these functions that are essential. But what you want to do here is to identify the general principle and explain how it works in the context of the debate. Once you've done that, the really useful thing to have within a principled argument is an analogy. And these can be quite hard to come up with, but they're really useful. So you want to come up with some similar situations where you apply the general principle in the way that you want to apply it. So not analogies for the other side, but analogies for your side. And it can be analogies can be very effective because quite often it's rather difficult to respond to them because to respond to an analogy, you sort of have to explain why the situation and emotion is different to that of a different example that we already accept as a society. So in the case of a moral duty to vote, I think the analogy is a little bit difficult here. But I've got two examples. The first is that we force people to pay taxes, even if they don't want to, so that the government can function. And this is something that everyone agrees on. Even an opposition team taking a very hard line wouldn't try to argue that actually individuals can just be completely free and do exactly what they want. We don't need to pay taxes. Since it's a fairly extreme stance to take, it's not a stance that I think most reasonable people would take within a debate. Another analogy here is that we make people sit on juries. So those are the groups of people who decide within trials whether someone is guilty or not, even if they don't want to, so that the justice system can function. So it's yet another example of where we do make individuals act on their responsibilities to society at large. And again, this is something that society agrees on in general. So in order for opposition to respond to this, they have to explain why servicing society by paying taxes or sitting on juries is different to servicing society by voting. And that can be rather difficult to do. And what you would say here is that these analogies show that the state, that is the government, makes people meet their responsibilities to society all the time. So this is a principle that we all agree on. Right. Once we've gone through some analogies, actually before we move on, I think quite often analogies are a little bit simpler. So if you have like a classic motion about this house would, where have we gone, ban smoking, for example, then there are quite simple analogies like probably drugs. In the case of government, you compare smoking to illegal drugs, explain why we ban illegal drugs and why that applies to smoking. In the case of opposition, you might have an analogy. In the case of alcohol, you explain why even though alcohol is harmful, if overconsumed, we allow individuals to make informed choices and take the choice to do this if it gives them pleasure and enjoyment, and then why that's more similar to smoking. So I think this is actually a very difficult motion to come up with analogies on. Quite often they will be a little bit easier, like in the case of smoking, which you can try to compare to drugs or alcohol, depending on which side of the motion you're on. After the analogy, you want to do some applications. You want to apply the principle to the situation in the motion. So in the case of a moral duty to vote, you'd say here that voting is in the public interest, just like taxes, just like serving juries. In this case, so that the best people are elected. It's very important for everyone to vote so that the results are reflective of society at large. Government takes policy that's good for everyone instead of just a group of people who are voting. And if people are not fulfilling this responsibility, then the state should step in and make them do so. Once you've done all of that, you finish off by telling us the importance or the significance of an argument. So why does the principle that you've got matter? Why does it matter more than other principles that might be present within the debate? Does the principle override practical outcomes? And why does it if it does do so? So in the case of a moral duty to vote, you might be able to establish here or argue that people have a responsibility to vote, which means that not wanting to vote is just not a valid reason to not vote. Lots of negatives in that sentence. I think the positive version of this is just that people should vote even if they don't want to. So that means as a result of this principle, opposition can't just run a case about freedom and people having the choice to vote or not. Well, they can, but like, they'll have to do a lot more analysis. And since you've already got this material, it's easy to respond to them. You might also say that the significance of this point is that looking at this general principle and how we apply it, the state can and should make people fulfill their societal responsibilities because they do all the time. Right. Okay, I think that brings us to the end. So to summarize, when it comes to practical points, you have when it comes to both types of points, you have the name to start with, and then importance and significance to end with. When it's practical points, you sort of have this problem, action, solution, or now action then, or context, mechanisms, outcomes. In the case of practical points, mechanisms are probably the most important part, since that's what's going to be disputed. In the case of principled points, you want to do things a little bit differently. You want to explain what the point is, provide some analogies, apply the principle to the situation, and then wrap it all together. All right. So that's the end of the presentation. Thank you for coming.